right. Thank you all for who have participated in organizing this and come here on this beautiful day. I'm really excited to be here and grateful for the time to share space with you all and learn from your work. I'm going to read a work in progress excerpt from a piece that's kind of like a hybrid piece called Whose Civil War Is This? Yeah. And I'll start. Guatemala, 1982. Ernesto knew that something would go wrong here. He didn't know if it would be the stolen medicine or the stolen films, but something might completely fall apart. The early morning before the sun had come out, he dragged a projector, 400 feet of 16 millimeter film, and an electrical inverter 8,000 feet up the Mazatenango Mountains toward a department rich in color, clothing, textiles, and agriculture, but likely lacking in audiovisual repair specialists. He'd driven his truck with boxes full of medical supplies, painkillers, bandages, gauze, antibiotics, anti-inflammatories, tourniquets, needles, vials full of medicines he'd never heard of. He was just a truck driver. The pharmacists were the ones who actually knew what this stuff did. So even though he was ready to hand over these supplies and project his training films for the militants of the cell, the reality was that he wasn't ready to describe the medical supplies, nor to fix anything that went wrong with the projector. He was doing the best he could. Luckily, it wasn't just up to him. As he pulled his truck over on at the start of the dirt road that split off before the turn toward the municipality's town center, he cut the lights just as he'd been instructed to do. This was his first time arriving at the cell's camp, and he was lost in thought when a figure in his peripheral vision knocked on the passenger window. He reached over from the driver's side and opened the door. "You're early. Lucky I was here. Let me have the keys. I should drive." "Okay." He complied quickly. He was a team player and knew when to follow the leadership's direction. But he didn't know this particular comrade, so anxiety crept up from the soles of his feet. "I'm Chico, subcomandante of the group. It's good to meet you, brother." "Buenos dias, Chico, un placer." Warmth emanated from the center of their palms as they shook hands. "Okay, I'm going to drive up here. The road's a little tricky with the mud." As they finished unloading the materials into the storage tent, a large canvas square that felt more permanent and fixed than Ernesto had expected, Chico nodded his head toward the only wooden box that had been stored in the cab of the truck, behind the front seats. "Should we store that one too?" No. That's the projector. I'll need that with me to make sure it works before we start the training. Can you help me carry it, though?" Chico nodded. "Okay, let's get you to your tent so you can unpack your stuff." They walked over a few meters away where the series of tents had been set up, 3 rows of 3 tents each, and Chico showed Ernesto where he'd be staying. "This is yours, and they told us that you needed more space to prepare the film, so you'll have this all to yourself. That work?" The tent was a larger one, enough for several people to sleep snugly if they lay down next to each other, maybe enough for 3 or 4, tightly packed in. But it was for Ernesto solo, a studio of sorts. "Yeah, thank you, this is perfect, but where's the generator?" "Ah, yes, that's right behind the supply tent. I'll show it to you later. And it's right behind the back of the tent that we thought could work as a backdrop for the screen." That works, but I brought a small one too." Ernesto pointed toward a rectangular metal tube, olive green colored, that was sticking out of the supply box that he'd been carrying with him in the truck. "Great. Okay, I'll leave you to it for now, but let me know if you need anything." Chico turned back toward the canvas tent to organize the medical supplies. Ernesto opened the lid of the wooden box with his film projection equipment and unloaded the materials so that he could turn the top of the box into a work table. 2 hand crank rewinds for moving the footage back and forth, a viewer to spool the film through and look at it without needing the projector itself, and 4 tin film canisters with the film he'd stolen from his brother's martial arts dojang in Guatemala City. He set up the 2 rewinds, clamping them onto the edge of the wooden box, and placed the rewind in the center. He had the remainder of the day to prepare everything for tomorrow's training, so he needed to hustle to actually edit the footage together. He'd never done this before. Sure, he'd edited together film, university projects. Those were opportunities for him to think through the sequence of material, and he'd been proud of the films he'd made, as experimental, sketchy, and tentative as they'd been. But this was different. This was a training for militants who were risking it all to fight the military, and he had the footage that they needed to understand the government's counterinsurgency. He loaded up the first reel into the rewind, ran it through the viewer, and then inserted the leader to the take-up spool. Right when he was about to pick up the first can of 100 feet spool of film, Chico appeared at the opening of the tent. Oye, so sorry to interrupt. He hunched over, his head just barely touching the top of the tent as he leaned through the opening left by the canvas door. No problem, brother. What's up? So I was wondering, any chance you need help with this? I noticed how heavy the box was, and I know that can be confusing to figure out the power around here. And to be honest, I'm pretty interested in learning. If it's not too much, could I help you out and kind of watch what you're doing? Yeah, man, that's fine, Ernesto said excitedly, but cautiously, keeping in mind the whole time that while he could definitely show Chico how to work the rewinds and the splicer, any shortcomings in the projector would be hard to fix, and he'd be embarrassed if this happened in front of one of the militants. But he couldn't say no, and he really didn't want to. He wanted this type of collaboration. Okay, so what I'm doing here, see, these are the rewinds we're going to load the film onto. Yeah. I've seen this in the movies. But are we going to be watching them on that little screen, just one person at a time? No. The thing is that these 4 rolls have all of the Caibiles training programs in them. But some of it is just exercise and practice, stuff that's not important for you guys. We need to go through all this stuff, cut out the combat training, splice that together so that we can have a single reel of all the best clips. You're going to cut the film, won't it damage it? Well, yeah, we're going to cut it, but we're going to tape it back together using this. It's a splicer. Ernesto held up a gray metallic object heavy in his hand and demonstrated how the guillotine worked to trim the film right at the sprocket and how the tape could be dispensed and then trimmed to create a perfect connection between 2 frames of film. The 2 men huddled over the single-person viewer and started running the first reel through, Ernesto gently maintaining the tension on the feed reel and Chico using his right hand to turn the crank and the take-up reel. As they moved through the film, Ernesto would call out, "Okay, stop," whenever the film got to a scene where there was hand-to-hand combat, weapons practice, mostly sword and staff combat, and he'd use the splicer to cut that clip, put the selection in a small bag, and splice the remaining together before continuing to watch it. After cutting out several sections where the soldiers in the film were doing the exercises, precisely the clips that Ernesto said were not needed, Chico asked to stop for a moment. Fíjese que I know you didn't want to include all that stuff, but those exercises, they actually look pretty useful for us. We train and do warm-ups, but we don't do it like they do. Yeah, right. They're good, but that's not the most important part of this. I think that figuring out how to deal with the sword styles and the hand-to-hand combat's the main thing, don't you think? I mean, yeah, that's crucial, but our battle with the Caibiles isn't just going to be about who can win during the fight. It's going to be about how prepared we are too, how we're feeling, how fit we are. Ernesto wasn't a military guy. He was a poet, a filmmaker, a student. But here he was explaining to a militant in Masate how to prepare a guerrilla strategy for defeating the more elite members of the Guatemalan military. He knew his place. He shouldn't be telling these guys what to do. But he also knew something about what was important in these films. He was the one who stole them from the dojang. He was the one who knew that these were used to train the elite military squad, and he was the one who risked it all to bring the knowledge all the way up here to the Cerro. But he also knew he wanted to take leadership from these folks, from his comrades in the making. Okay, well, what I'm worried about is that the film's going to be too much, that it's going to have too much separate stuff to learn. This is supposed to help us, help you all prepare. So I don't know what I'm worried about. I'm just worried about wasting time. Chico straightened up his back, turned his body to Ernesto. Look, we need these films, and we can do just the same thing we're doing here. Separate the clips, but instead of just splicing them back together, we can make 2 piles, make 2 films. Ernesto could tell when he was receiving an order, but more importantly, when to follow the order. The 2 guys got back to work, this time making 2 separate piles of selected clips, and once they'd gone through the first can of film, they started splicing the 2 groups of clips together. As they were finishing up, a voice came through the opening in the tent. Ernesto turned and looked up from the splicer and saw that there was a group of 5 militants standing behind the comrade who had gotten their attention. Chico, hey, can we watch the films? The comrade asked, making eye contact with Chico. Chico spoke to them, using language that Ernesto didn't understand, just before turning back to Ernesto and saying, I'm giving the approval for this, and we should wait to put it on the projector until it's time for the comrades to watch together, but let's let them come in here and watch a little bit of our selects on the viewer here, without sound. Ernesto paused for a moment, taking in the faces of the comrades who'd gathered, and he started to remember the vibe he'd felt when he was watching the workouts at the dojang in the city, the way his brother had practiced sparring with his partners, how they'd started all their practices with chanting, with group stretching, how they'd executed their forms with one another, sword on sword, staff on sword, some kind of trust needed to swing at one another with weapons that would kill. trust that he'd seen in each movement of their bodies. He turned back to Chico. Got it. I think we can all see if we just huddle around and close the tent so there's less light. He gestured at the comrades to come in the tent, to sit down in front of the makeshift table they'd made out of the box. He put his hand back on the take-up reel and started turning it to the right. Thank you.